Today I'm giving you part 2 of my series in how to dial in the perfect Avenged Sevenfold style guitar tone. Over the course of this video, I'm going to cover some basic concepts on equalization. I'm going to talk about what goals we're shooting for when dialing in these guitar tones. And finally, I'm going to sit and dial in these guitar tones with you using the Fractal Audio FM9 or Axe effects. So stick around. Welcome back, folks. This is Ray again with Hillwinter Music. It's been a long time. Sorry it's taken me so long to put this video out. My family got really busy over Christmas time. Lots of stuff has been going on with work, but we will press on and I'm happy to bring this content to you finally. You might hear my family in the background throughout the video. Everyone's homesick right now. Kids are noisy. That's just the way it is. Now I need to let you know off the bat that this is going to be a long video, and I'm going to cover a lot of stuff for beginners here. So if you're an experienced guitar player, you probably already know a lot of this. Feel free to skip ahead over what you already know. But as I keep saying, my purpose with these videos is to give people who are just starting out the information that I wish I had when I was starting out. In part 1 of this video series, I talked about how the band dials in their studio tone. That's what we're going over this time as well. We're not talking about their live tone. I talked about how the band uses 2 guitar tones and they quad track everything. They've done this throughout all their albums. And like I said, today I want to actually go over dialing those tones in. Before we do that though, there's some basic concepts I want to talk about with you. And the first one is, why can't I just give you the amp settings that they use and be done with it? And when I was starting out as a guitar player, that's what I wanted, but that is not actually possible. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. First off, I talked last time about how the band has used a number of different amplifiers throughout their career. They will swap through multiple amps in one song. They'll change amps song to song. So I can't actually say this one amp or this one set of settings is their tone. Another very important reason that I can't just give you settings is because of what are called component tolerances. No 2 amplifiers, even of the same brand, even of the same model, sound the same. Manufacturers who make the components that go into building amplifiers have a certain percentage of variation they're allowed to have whenever they make these things. With components like resistors, for example, usually you can get them within about 1% tolerance. And most components that go into building amplifiers have very tight tolerances like that. But there's one very important set of components when building amplifiers that often have a very wide margin of tolerance. And those are tone pots or potentiometers, the knobs you use to dial in the tone on your amplifier. Now I encourage you to go do some research online about how potentiometers work, but oftentimes these components can have upwards of 20% variation in their tolerances. That's as reported by tone pot manufacturers and proven through testing of actual amplifiers. And that's 20% both ways for a total of 40%. If you're a mechanic and you have a 10mm socket and there is a 40% tolerance variation in the sockets you buy, well, you might end up with a 5mm socket. So if I tell you to set an amplifier's treble control to 12 o'clock on your amp, you might need to change it to 3 o'clock. Now you can buy fancier tone pots that have tighter tolerances, but even the more expensive ones like CTS pots, for example, still have about 10% variance in them. So the reality is the settings are not going to match. And that is why it's so important for us to use our ears. But if you don't have a lot of experience with this stuff, often you don't know what to look for with your ears. I used to hate when guys would tell me to use my ears. I don't know what I'm looking for. And that's what I want to discuss with you next. Let's go over some basics of equalization. Now, when we talk about equalization, what we're really talking about is sound waves or sound frequencies. A sine wave, that is a single sound frequency on its own in its purest form. And virtually all sounds that we can hear with our ears are made up of multiple sine waves. And we measure those in hertz. 1 hertz, a single hertz, is 1 cycle of the wave. And the limit to human hearing goes down to about 20 hertz and all the way up to 20,000 hertz. That's the range we're working in. Let's take a quick look at this visually. Okay, you'll see on my screen here that I have a session of Reaper pulled up. I have a tone generator on one track here to generate a single sine wave, and then I have FabFilter Pro Q3 pulled up. This is just a visual representation, and down here in the bottom you'll see the visual representation goes from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz like I talked about. Now I'm going to play a single sine wave. This will not sound pleasant, so you might want to turn your speakers or your headphones down when this comes on. I'm going to play it now. Have a listen and a look. Sorry, that sounded terrible, but you get the picture. That's what a single sound frequency looks like. Now, conversely, let's look at how a guitar track looks with the same visual representation here on FabFilter Pro Q3. You can see it's made up of a bunch of sine waves, much more complex sound. Now, I want to give you a visual tool to help identify what it is we're looking for when we're attacking certain frequencies to either get rid of sounds we don't like or to increase sounds we do like. You should see a graphic across my screen now. These are the 7 bad system dwarves, or the 7 dwarves of equalization. This is a trick to help you remember what each frequency range sounds like. If you're playing your guitar and you go, this sounds really flubby or muddy and inarticulate, really boomy, then using this graphic, you're going to want to look at decreasing the low end, down from around 100 hertz to around 300 hertz. If you think your tone sounds really barky or harsh, you're going to want to dial back from about 1000 hertz to around 3000 hertz. And it works the opposite too. If you think your guitar tone needs to sound a bit more forward or a bit more dangerous, dial in more 3000 hertz. Make it sound a little harsh. Now, another trick you can use to identify frequencies that you want to attack and either add more of or take away from is to think of them in terms of vowels. Because when you speak, your mouth produces vowels by manipulating the frequencies of your voice. So when we talk about the really low frequencies on the low end, the sub frequencies from 20 hertz to 60 hertz, we're going to be thinking of them in terms of the vowel ooh. And as you move up into the low mids from about 200 hertz to 300 hertz, that's going to start to sound like the vowel O. Keep going up to the mid range around 500 hertz, it's going to start to sound like the vowel ah. Eventually ah when you get to the high mids in around the 1K to 3000 hertz range. And when you get up to the really high stuff, it's going to sound like the vowel E. If you've ever been to a concert where the band is having a hard time with feedback happening in the venue, think back to what that feedback sounded like. It should sound like a vowel, a screeching E sound, or a really loud OO sound. You can use that to help dial out the frequencies producing the feedback. Now, whenever you're trying to dial in a guitar tone, there's a very useful workflow you can follow to try and systematize this process. And that workflow is LDFC. That stands for listen, diagnose, fix, then compare. So what you want to do is listen to your guitar tone, pick out anything you like or don't like about it, and figure out what frequency range might be causing that. That's your diagnosis. Then adjust your settings to fix it, and then try and do a comparison between the before and the after. This isn't something I've come up with myself. You can learn about this at URM Academy, the Unstoppable Recording Machine. Lots of great content there for free on YouTube. And the very last thing I want to talk about before we get into actually dialing in the guitar tones is referencing. If you're trying to get something similar from a band you really like, pull up one of their tracks and listen to it while you're dialing in your own guitar tone. Put it on a speaker, a Bluetooth speaker, or even on your cell phone. Listen to it on headphones. This is not cheating. This is something that every single world-renowned mixing engineer does on every session. All of the pros do it. And to help you out with this, I actually want to show you some raw guitar tracks from Avenged Sevenfold now. Let's take a look at those. Okay, as you can see, I've got a session of Reaper pulled up here, and I have 2 sets of stereo guitar tracks on here. These are both from a song called Natural Born Killers on the album Nightmare. These are the raw, unprocessed tracks from that album. First, let's have a listen to the primary tone, what I would call the mid-range focus tone. For this tone, they were using a diesel amplifier. I can't remember the model. It's the flagship diesel amplifier, the main one they sell with the matching cab, I believe, vintage 30 speakers in it. Have a listen. Okay, now we're going to have a listen to the other track, which is what I would call the supplemental tone, the secondary tone that the band uses when they're quad tracking. As always, they used a Bogner Uberschell for this guitar tone, the matching cab as well. Let's have a listen to what that sounds like. Now, if you want to screen record this video so you have these sounds for yourself, for your own referencing, go ahead. I will try and post a link in the description so you can download these. These are just supposed to be an example of what the band is going for. This is one iteration of the formula they've used for every single one of their albums. Now let's hear what these guitars sound like together. Another thing you'll want to note is how tightly these performances were played. You can barely tell that it's different performances because they tracked them so identically. Really quickly, let's talk about the goals we're going for when we're dialing in this tone. As I said in part 1 of this series, the band usually quad tracks, and for that they use 2 guitar tones. The first tone, which I would call the main tone or the primary tone, I would describe as a mid-ranged focus guitar tone, where the mid-range of the amp is the most prominent piece of the tone. Now, this would typically be an American style guitar amplifier. It's going to be a tone with a medium level of distortion. It's not going to have a ton of saturation on it. This is going to be a crunch style tone. The distortion is going to be more granular. This would typically be an amplifier with a lot of negative feedback. Go online and research what negative feedback is. This will be a drier sounding amplifier. It will be a colder sounding amplifier. It will be a more cold biased amplifier. Go online and look up a cold biased preamp versus a hot biased preamp. This amp is going to have a tight, defined low end. It's going to be bouncy like an elastic band. The second guitar tone we're going for is what I would call the secondary tone or the supplemental guitar tone. The purpose of this tone is going to be to add a certain character. This guitar tone is going to be a primarily high frequency guitar tone. It's going to have a lot of high end in it. It will typically be more of a UK style amplifier. It will be a much more saturated tone. It's going to be a warmer tone, a more mushy tone. This could be an amp with less or even no negative feedback in the power amp. It will be a warmer biased preamp. Now, all of these are guidelines for dialing in the band's tone. None of these are hard and fast rules. I'll talk about this in the next video, but historically for the primary tone, the band has used a Marshall DSL 100. They've used a custom Bogner nicknamed Caveman. They've used a diesel amplifier for this. They've used a JCM 800. Nowadays, they use the signature Hillwinter amp for it. And for the secondary high frequency tone, the band always uses a Bogner Uberschell. I think in the past for this secondary tone, they've used a Mesa Boogie dual rectifier or triple rectifier. Those two amps sound very similar to the Bogner Uberschell. Okay. Now that we've got that all out of the way, this is already a very long video. Let's dive into dialing these tones in together. All right, if you look at my screen, I have the editor for the Fractal Audio FM9 pulled up. I've got an input block, an output block, I've got an amp block and a cab block, and then I have a looper, which I've pre-recorded a loop on. This is from the album The Stage. Have a listen to this quick. I'm going to use that loop to dial in the tone here. We're starting off in the amp block. I have a 5153 Stealth on the red channel pulled up. I've decided that's the amp I'm going to use for the primary tone. In the cab block, I have pulled up what I believe is a Mesa cab with vintage 30 speakers in it. There's a number of cabs you can use. The real key is to use vintage 30 speakers. That's what the band uses on virtually everything. And whatever the impulse response you're using, it should be with a SM57 microphone. That is a Shure SM57, and it should be pointed pretty well at the center of the speaker. For those who don't know or have experience with this, the closer to the center of the speaker that the microphone is, the more high end you're going to get. As you move it out towards the cone of the speaker, you're going to get less high end. And then as for the low end, the closer you have the microphone to the overall speaker, that's going to give you more low end. If you back the microphone off, that's going to give you less low end, and you're going to hear a bit more of the room sound in that microphone. The recording engineer for Avenged Sevenfold has said he usually keeps it off of the speaker by about an inch and right in the center. There's two schools of thought when it comes to positioning a microphone on a guitar cab speaker. One is that you use the position of the microphone as your first stage of EQ, like I just talked about. The other theory is if you're in a hurry or if you're in a live situation, you just point it at the most obvious spot, which would be, say, the center or slightly off center, and then you use the guitar amp to equalize what you have at that point. In the Fractal, there's a lot of different cab impulses that have vintage 30 speakers in them. There's Mesa cabs, there's Friedman cabs, there's the new, what are they called? The Dynacab option that Fractal Audio has. Those have a lot of vintage 30 options in there. So just use something with vintage 30s and an SM57. Now in the cab block, I'm also going to go to the preamp tab here because another important aspect of the band's tone is the preamps they use to record their microphones in studio. As far as I know, the band has always used Neve style preamps. I've seen them in studio with 1081 Neve preamps. To get that sound on here, I'm going to go to the preamp type vintage. I believe that is the emulation of a Neve preamp on here, and I'm just going to dial in maybe at max level 2 saturation here. I'm going to set the saturation to 2, and the drive just to keep it right in the middle. I don't want it clipping at all. Let's listen to the clip here. All right, now you could see on the cab block that it was close to clipping, but not totally clipping on there. That should be just enough saturation on there to get you that classic preamp sound. Okay, now we're going to go through the LDFC process. That's listen, diagnose, fix, and then compare. I'm going to start the loop, and then let's hear how this primary tone sounds. Okay, to me, right off the bat, it sounds really well balanced. Nothing sticks out right away. I do want the mid-range to stick out a bit more than everything else. I also want to adjust the gain because I think it has a bit too much distortion. It sounds a little inarticulate. So let's do that right off the bat. Let's adjust the gain. That's too little. That's too much. It sounds mushy. That sounds just right to me, and you'll note that's very little gain on here. That's just under level 2. And none of these tones are really going to be high gain. When you quad track guitars, all the distortion stacks together and it'll sound like there's a lot of distortion, but there's actually not. There's just many pieces of a little distortion. Okay, now I want the mid-range to stick out a bit more, so let's adjust the mid control here. That's too much, it sounds honky. That's too little, it sounds scooped. Okay, that's a good amount of mid-range for me. I also want to turn up the high end just to give this tone a bit more edge. So let's do that now. I want to do that without giving it too much fizz. Now it's fizzy, that's too much. Too little. Sounds like it has a blanket over top of it. That sounds great. And now I just want to make sure it has a nice, distinct, bouncy low end. I think I could probably dial in a little bit more bass. Let's have a listen. That's too much. Too boomy. That's too low. And right there is good. That's where I started to feel, almost feel instead of hear, a bit of bounce in my headphones from the palm muting. Okay, now let's take a look at this secondary guitar tone here. I'm going to switch to scene 2 for that. I've got the same loop pulled up. For that, I'm going to use the Bogner Uberschall amp on the FM9, just like the band always does. For the cab block, they have an Uberschall cab here built into the FM9. That cab has 2 types of speakers in it. One's a V30. I can't remember what the other one is, but we're going to use the V30 IR for it with an SM57 pointed at the cap, again in the center of the speaker. I've done the same thing with the preamp tab, or I will do the same thing as the preamp tab. I'll use the vintage type for the preamp type, which is the Neve emulation, I believe. I'm using high quality mode here. Dial the saturation to 2, which I've found is to be a good spot. You could do a little less than that or a little more. I wouldn't go too much more though. I'm going to play the loop and dial in the drive so it's high but not crossing the red, not clipping. Okay, now that that's set up, we can do our LDFC. Listen, diagnose, fix, then compare. Let's play the loop and hear how this sounds. Okay, so it sounds dark, like there's a blanket over it. It sounds really boomy. There's a lot of low end and too much distortion. First thing I'm going to do is dial back the low end a bit, get it sounding a bit nicer, and then I'll hit the distortion here. Let's pull back that low end. Now let's set the distortion where we want it. Too much. Too little. I'm happy with it right there. It sounds pretty distinct, but it's still got some edge to it. Now we want this tone to be a high frequency focused tone, so I'm going to dial up the treble. Now I'm going to dial this really high on the Uberschall. It's going to seem unusual to turn it up almost all the way to 10, but that's because the taper of the tone pots on the Bogner Uberschall in particular are different than most amplifiers. It's different from what most manufacturers use. You wouldn't normally turn an amplifier up to 10, but again, use your ears. If it sounds good around 10, then it's good. And there's an explanation for that in this case, which is the different tapers. All right, you'll see I have that just under 10. It's starting to get fizzy. It's got a lot of high end there, which is what we're using this tone for. We could maybe use a bit more mid-range to give it some edge to balance it out with the other tone, because we don't want them to be too different. Let's have a listen to that. That's scooped out, no mid-range. Too much, it sounds honky. Remember Honky the Dwarf? And I'm actually going to take a bit more low end away because I think it still sounds boomy. You'll notice I took out a lot of low end. Again, different tapers on the tone pots for this amp, and that includes the presence control actually on this amp. So I am going to dial that in. It doesn't work the same way a normal presence control on most amplifiers do. The Bogner Uberschall is a odd beast for sure. There, I like it right there. The presence control on these amps is more like a high mid control in my opinion. Those guitar tones sound great to me. They sound like what we're looking for, so let's try them in a track now. Okay, I've gone ahead and used the tones that we just dialed in to record a rendition of the verse riff from the song The Stage. Here is the primary tone. It is double tracked. Let's have a listen to how that sounds. All right, and this is the secondary tone on its own. Have a listen. You'll note that that one is a bit quieter. I have it turned down and just blended in with the primary tone. It's not supposed to overpower it. It's just supposed to complement it a little. Here's how they sound together. And now in context with some drums. Sounds great. That one worked out really well. Another important aspect of shaping these guitar tones that I want to talk about quickly is the mixing engineer. Whenever bands record an album, they'll come up with a guitar tone that they like, that they think represents how the album should sound. They'll record everything and then they'll send that to be mixed by the mixing engineer. And the mixing engineer's job is to try and maintain that sound that the band has created while adjusting it a little so that everything fits together in the mix. And that way you can hear each of the parts clearly over the speakers or your headphones. And the band Avenged Sevenfold has used the same mixing engineer for virtually all of their albums throughout their career. That mixing engineer is Andy Wallace. World renowned, he has a ton of big albums to his name, and he does have a couple unique things about his approach to mixing that I want to go over with you. Okay, we're back here with our rendition of The Stage, and I just have one guitar track soloed right now, and I have Fab Filter Pro Q3 pulled up again just as a visual representation. Let's have a listen to that quick and a look at it quick. Now what I'm going to do is mute that guitar track, but I'm going to keep the visual representation of it up on a loop so we can see it. Now, for most engineers, when they are mixing a heavy guitar track like this, the first thing they will do is they will do a high-pass filter or a low cut. And we can do one of those in here. I'll show you visually in Pro Q3. This is what that looks like. It's just chopping off the low end completely here at the bottom because all of that's going to be filled in by the bass guitar anyway. It doesn't really add to the guitar sound, so we can get rid of it. And that way it's not masking the sound of the bass guitar. And most of the time, engineers mixing heavy guitar tracks like this will high pass all of the sub frequencies up to 60 hertz and keep going up into 100 hertz. Andy Wallace has a bit of a different approach that he has talked about before. When he started out his career, he says he never used high-pass filters. He said he always just attenuated the low end. He would just lower it rather than cutting it out completely. I can show you that here in Pro Q3. This is what that would look like with a low shelf. So you can see it's just lowering everything below my threshold. It's not chopping it right off like I showed you before. Andy Wallace has talked about how nowadays he does both. He will lower the low end if he needs to get rid of some of it, or boost it if he needs a little bit more of that heavy bounce I talked about in the guitar tone. And if he needs to clean up anything more in the low end, like a little bit of mud he's created by boosting it, he will then use a high pass filter to clean that up. A couple final things I wanted to say. One, don't be afraid to use amp modeling plugins. Lots of the biggest bands out there today are using amp modeling plugins. If you are someone who's using a real amp, all the same concepts apply. If all you have at home is a small Fender practice amp with only one tone control on it, or maybe you're using a digital Boss Katana practice amp, all the same principles apply. You can adjust the tone knob on your guitar. You can use different pickups or different guitars. Use what you have and make it work. A few final notes about Avenged Sevenfold guitar tone. The band uses passive pickups. If you're using active pickups, you might just have to dial back the distortion a bit because you're hitting the front of the amp harder. The other thing to keep in mind is the pick you're using. Now, Synyster Gates has been using the Dunlop Gator Grip picks for a long time. He's been using the 2.0 size, the really thick ones. That's what he's recorded most of their albums with. Very recently, he started using lighter ones, the 0.7. Picks do actually make a big difference on your sound though. And so if you're recording and it's not working, try using a different pick, different thickness, different material. Sometimes that's all it takes to get the sound you've been looking for. I do want to quickly touch on two instances in which the band has deviated from this 2 guitar tone formula that I've talked about. City of Evil and Hail to the King. On Hail to the King, instead of having a mid-frequency focused tone and a high-frequency focused tone, the band got rid of the high-frequency tone. They filled in some of the high frequencies with the mid-tone, and their supplementary tone became a low frequency guitar tone. And that was to fill in the low end a lot more for the style of music they were playing on that album. Now for City of Evil, the band stuck to the same tone formula that we've talked about, but instead of quad tracking everything where there were 4 individual performances, the band double tracked all of their rhythm guitars, and they used a splitter while doing it so that they could record through 2 amps at the same time. And that's because there was so much going on that album that if they quad tracked everything, you just wouldn't be able to hear what was going on. And that's it, folks. That's the end of the video. Thank you if you've followed me through it this far. I know this one was ridiculously long. I probably should have split this into a few more parts. If you found this useful, please like the video. Feel free to give it a dislike if you thought it was too long. Let me know what you thought in the comments. I really appreciate all the feedback on the last video. I hope this information was helpful to you. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.